Hello and welcome to the apple painting. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a bunch of primary colors. I'm going to use some white and I'm going to do a full color painting utilizing a blending technique, just like the last video where we used a wet brush. So I started with a line drawing here. You can see it there. Those are the colors I have right there. So I have a couple reds, yellow, blue, green. I'm going to use the blue to shade things, make them darker, and add the white to highlight certain areas. So I'm using a flat brush again here. And the first thing I'm going to do is put down an underpainting. So I water down the paint, make it really thin, and I'm just going to put big patches of color, kind of like blocking in. I'm following the contours of the apple when I put the strokes down here. So think about cross contours. Just using a wet brush there just to blend the edges. So now I'm doing the same with red here. What I did is I looked for the mid-tone, and again I watered it down real thin, like watercolor. And I'm just going to put it down. Again, that's called an underpainting. It's just so you get the basic values applied first. Still applying in cross contour strokes, just to follow the form of what we're painting here. Messed up right there. Okay, so again, I wiped all the paint off. I'm just using a wet brush, and I'm just brushing against the edges where the yellow meets the red, and that'll blend those colors together. So you won't have like a hard edge or transition between them. So I'm just looking at the markings on it now. There's a little bit of red kind of lines mixed in with the yellow area there. And so I've just put them down with really, really watered down paint. And that helps the paint kind of flow into the yellow. So now I'm adding a little bit more red. This has less water in it. And again, even less, just getting thicker there and darkening the value there on the right side. And then just getting some of the shading where it goes down into where the stem is. So again, just using a wet brush there and kind of brushing the red and the yellow in together. Just again, blend them smooth the transition between the two colors or values. So now I've gone with the second red, that darker red, and I'm putting it on the shadow side. So this is pretty much straight paint at this point, very little water. And again, following the contours, just looking at some of the markings, some of the lines you can kind of see, just kind of exaggerating those cross contours. So now I've added a little bit of red to that, to blue to that darker red, and I'm just putting that on the shadow side. It's a good idea to not use black. It'll create like a weird shadow with the red. So that's why I've mixed up almost like a purple value, and I'm putting that, it's watered down a little bit, but putting it in all the shadow areas, the dark areas, just creating contrast. Remember, contrast makes things more interesting. It helps create the form. So now I'm using a wet brush, and I'm brushing that dark purple back into the apple, just blending those colors, those tones. And again, where the stem is. Again with a wet brush, anywhere where there's a hard edge, where one value meets another, and you get a line, I'm just blending that and smoothing it out. Almost works like smudging, if you think of pencil shading. I've added a little bit more purple, it's a little bit thicker. Again, just putting it in that back area to create that contour where it goes down into where the stem is. And just on the very back edge, again, following the contours or the cross contours of that apple. This is just the wet brush technique again to blend. Again, I'm just putting paint on that edge and then pulling it into the center. And that blends those edges together. just erasing some of the pencil lines. I was having a hard time getting a nice clean edge when I was doing this painting. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start putting some of the highlights. That's those specular highlights, so those white areas, those really bright areas where the light is bouncing off kind of the glossier, shiny surface. So I've mixed a little bit of water in there, but I'm just using white with a little bit of yellow. And I'm brushing the strokes again in the contour direction. So I'm adding a little bit more white, making it a little bit thicker. I'm going to put it on kind of the inside areas that I just painted to create a really bright white area or spot. It's that reflected light off the shiny surface. Okay, and here's the wet brush again. And I'm brushing in those contour directions and just blending kind of the edges of the highlights in a little bit. You can almost use it as an eraser at times too if you have little spots. There was a little white spot that I just got rid of there. So what I've done there is I've mixed a tiny bit of red in with the yellow, and then I've added a little bit of water, a little bit of muddy water, and I'm just putting kind of the shadow values where the yellow values are, kind of the back edges. Again, I'm trying to add a little bit more contrast to the right side. So I've got got a little bit of purple there on the edge, and again, trying to clean up that edge there. And again, just going to blend it with a wet brush. Again, just pulling that darker value in towards the center of the apple. So I'm going to start with the stem. It's kind of like a brownish tone I'd created by mixing kind of the purple and some blue and some red uh, all together. And I'm just putting it right in the middle of the stem. And I'm going to try to create a little bit of an edge here for that depressed area there that the stem comes out of. And again, I'm putting some kind of thicker white here just to get those specular highlights, those really bright white areas. So I added a little bit of black. and I'm just kind of putting this edge on both the inside and the outside of the stem. It's a little bit lighter. It's almost a gray value to start, just because the light kind of hits the edge of the stem in the example I was looking at. And I saw kind of the very end of that stem was a little bit lighter as well. So now I have the really fine, it's a very stiff brush, and I'm adding some watered down paint, watered down white and a yellowish brownish value, and just hitting the end of that stem. And the paint got a little bit too watery at this point. I wanted these two lines here to be a little bit thinner. And so I would have had to use a little bit of a thicker paint. It kind of just bled a little bit. So at this point, I didn't really like the red value for whatever reason. Seeing it now back on video, I kind of like the lighter tones. But to me, the apple I was looking at was a darker red, so I watered down some red and I created a wash. And the attempt there was to kind of more saturate the red color and make it a little bit darker. I was trying to increase contrast, and there's some smaller details that I'd missed at the start. I'm just using a wet brush there again, just blending, because I have layers of paint. That allows me to blend the layers underneath with that kind of red wash that I just put in. And I'm just hitting all the edges where dark tones meet light tones, or the red meets the greenish yellow. So I'm bumping up the contrast there with the yellow by mixing in a little bit of a kind of a grayish, brownish value. And again, trying to create more form. The more contrast you have, typically the more form you'll create as well. And I really wanted to bump up that highlight area, that white area. So I'm just putting kind of this yellowish value down first. And then I'm going to end up putting white on top of some of those areas. As the paint starts to run out on the brush, again, I try to blend with that, and it almost smudges it, more like a pencil crayon effect. Now I'm adding a darker value there. I think there might have been a little bit of black mixed in there, but it was mostly a really deep violet or purple color. Let's water down a little bit. Again, just to blend with the underpainting I'd created. That's the reason you do the painting in a series of layers, so that you can kind of build things up. Right on the very bottom edge there, I usually add kind of a very darker value. I never did get to creating a cast shadow, but it just helps to set whatever you're painting onto a surface and not have it look like it's floating in the air. Again, just hitting those highlights. So now I've gone with the white, thicker white, just building up those lighter areas or bright areas. So I've gone back to the thin brush here, and there's kind of this spotted pattern on this apple here, and I just started to try to get some of that texture in. And that's watered down a little bit, so it doesn't quite cover the entire red underneath. And then I'm going to add kind of little dots to the edges of where the highlight was. Because the example I was looking at, it wasn't just a kind of a smooth patch. There were little kind of dots around the highlight areas. And this is much thicker paint, so it sits on top of the layers below it. So at this point, I was still concerned about the edges here, and I don't know how well this worked, but I just went around with my pencil just to try to clean up those edges. A kind of red splotch on the right side and the bottom was really bothering me. I'm not sure how successful it was, but I just wanted to kind of clean up the edge and separate it from the white below it. So that's it there. That's the apple. I'd really appreciate it if you guys could go ahead and send me some images of some of the stuff that you've been doing, just so I can give you some feedback and see